Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to our webinar today on the Global Off-Grid Solar Market Report for H1 2021. My name is Jeff Ketelaars. I'm the Senior Research Manager at GOGLA, the Association for the Off-Grid Solar Industry. And I will be joined today by 4 of the report authors who will be sharing some of their key insights into data and trends that we are seeing from the first half of this year. For those who are new, the report contains the results of our half-yearly sales data collection, which is undertaken jointly by GOGLA, the Lighting Global Program, and Efficiency for Access. Before I hand over to the panelists, I want to let you know that you can take part as well in the Q&A at the end of this session. So please do submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If there's a particular panelist you want to target your question to, please do that. You can also vote on other people's questions. So if there's one you find particularly interesting and you would like to see answered, please give that question a tick. The session will be recorded and made available afterwards. And lastly, if you experience any problems, please do let us know via the chat function, and then we'll see what we can do to try and sort those out. But before I really hand over, we would love to know for you to share the type of organization that you come from. So I'm going to open a poll now. And if you can just add in the description of your organization, that will be fantastic, because this helps us in gearing our work and the report to the audience that we have as effectively as possible. Yeah, I can see that quite a few people have already submitted. I'm just going to leave it open for a few more seconds. We are at 60%. Can we get it to 75? Close to 80. Can we get anyone else to vote? I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. See if we can get a few more participants. 78%. Great, let me close it now and then share. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that the main group in our audience today are off-grid solar companies, also with a representation from consultants, researchers, and also industry association, as well as others. Yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks a lot for responding to that poll. All right, what I'll do now is hand over to some of the team who have been working really hard to on the insights gathered for this latest report. Each of them will share one of their main findings from the data and then pass around the group. So we have 2 rounds, so everyone will share 2 of their key insights. Yeah, without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague at GOGLA, Oliver Reynolds, to kick us off. So Oliver, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Jeff. Thank you everyone for joining. So I'd like to kick off by sharing my first insight and giving kind of the global perspective on the lighting product sales for the January-June 2021 period. For those who are not used to the way we present our data in lighting products, we count lanterns, multi-light systems, which are used 3 to 10 watt peak, and solar home systems, which are larger kit products. Overall, for this round of data collection, we've seen 3.46 million units sold. This represents a 4%, a moderate decrease on the second half of 2020, the previous reporting round. If you take into account seasonality, where usually the sales in the second half of the year are higher than the sales in the first half of the year, you could actually see this as a sign of relative stability in the market. But we're definitely not back to the growth trajectory that we were on before the pandemic hit the market. I'd like to highlight that there's been a variety of trends affecting the market beyond COVID and the way that governments respond. There has been the differences in policy, regulation, support for the sector, access to finance, political stability in certain markets. So there's a myriad of underlying factors that means we have very contrasting trends. And we really invite you to look at the data beyond the headlines that we'll be able to share today and to look into the report because to really understand what's happening, you need to look at more granular level data than what we'll be able to show today. To highlight this, I'd like to already talk about a first discrepancy or first contrasting trend that we see, which is between pay-go sales and cash sales. So pay-as-you-go sales have been growing over the last couple of rounds, albeit at a slow pace, and we're actually reaching the highest level of sales that we've ever recorded for pay-go volumes. So they only grew 1% compared to the previous reporting round, but for the first time, we've exceeded the 1.2 million barrier in terms of units sold. We have, I think, 1,208,000 products recorded as sold. So that's, as I said, the highest level we've ever reached. In the meanwhile, cash sales have continued to decrease 7% compared to the previous reporting round, and are now 30% lower than where they were prior to the pandemic. So the second half of 2019 that you see in dark pink, let's say, on the charts. So a contrasting trend between already these two roads to market, let's say. And if we look also at the company level, we also see that over the last 18 months, companies have fared fairly differently. Companies, about 57% of companies that reported during this round, but also reported during the second half of 2019 before the pandemic, 57% report lower sales than in that pre-pandemic reporting round. 41% report stable or higher sales. And actually 28% of companies report higher sales with an increase of more than 75%. So we can really see that there's obviously the effects linked to the maturity and size of the companies, but we can really see that there are very different circumstances depending on companies' exposure to different markets, ability to refund, business model, and so on. So yeah, before I hand over to Joe, I want to highlight once again that probably now more than ever, we want to encourage you to look into these data in more detail than we'll be able to share today to really get a strong understanding of the market. But over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Oliver. And while we do invite you to look really at a deeper level on the different sales statistics that we're seeing, one high level number that did strike a chord with me is the 23 million people that were not reached due to the pandemic and due to the slowdown in growth that we've seen in the off-grid solar market. And of course, we all know that with the access to clean lighting, clean electricity, there's a myriad of additional impacts that are unlocked for our household, ranging from, of course, access to clean lighting, but also income generating opportunities, particularly also through productive use equipment. And income generation, productive uses also means that households are much more resilient to any kind of crisis they might encounter. And the biggest crisis, of course, that the world is facing on top of the pandemic is the climate crisis, as we're all heading into the COP26 this weekend. I also wanted to highlight another key statistic. 86 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent have been already avoided thanks to the off-grid solar sector. That is equivalent to 22 coal plants taken off for an entire year. So it's a major contribution to mitigating climate change. But of course, the slowdown in growth has also meant there has been a setback in our trajectory to reaching SG7. So maybe now more than ever, it's really important that we continue to support the off-grid solar sector, not only to safeguard connections already made, but also ensuring that we're putting the sector back on a firm growth trajectory in order for us all to meet the SG7 goals. There's a few critical elements in terms of support. Very essential, of course, is the access to finance piece. We are really happy to see that the Energy Access Relief Fund has now been launched and is open for business, supporting particularly the smaller companies that have been hit maybe hardest by the pandemic. But also the AFDB has put in place the off-grid recovery platform. And we see continued support from existing investors towards the off-grid solar companies, which is of course crucial. On top, we all know that the support from governments is really essential in not only starting and nurturing off-grid market development, but also sustaining growth throughout a crisis. And we will see later on, particularly when we go to the country level, how different governments have really been able to, through their support, to help the off-grid solar sector weather the crisis and continue to grow, even though we were facing a pandemic. Now passing on to Cherie, who will start talking about appliances.
Hi, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting my insight today. And I'm going to be talking about the appliances that you can see in the top right corner. So refrigeration, TVs, fans, and solar water pumps. So overall, there has been a significant decrease in sales compared to the second half of 2020, and that is for all of those appliances. And overall figures remain significantly lower than pre-COVID levels. So as we can see in the charts in front of us, what does that mean? That means that sale appliances have shrunk in comparison to the last round, and the total volume of key appliances that have been sold between January and June 2021 are at their lowest since the second half of 2018, and that was when the first time the appliance data was published. And in addition to anecdotal information from industry experts, so they indicate that this is partly due to the decrease in solar home system sales. So televisions, fans, and refrigerators are typically sold in bundled as bundled appliances across main markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's look at TVs now, take a little deep dive into the TVs. So TVs have experienced the largest absolute decrease, likely in line with decreased sales of 21 to 100 watt PEX solar home systems. And TVs have fallen around 18% in comparison to the second half in 2020. So if we're looking at the TV chart in front of us, we can see the green pillar that represents January to June 2021, and then just before that, the second half of 2020. So that's where we can see that 18% drop. In TV, sales had first performed comparatively well. So again, looking at that grey pillar, and although it was COVID, but there was a lot of increase for information and entertainment. So that is why we've seen that increase during those times. And we can attribute the decrease that we've seen now in this last half due to two factors. So we have COVID-19 induced supply chain issues, in addition to the decrease in solar power system sales. And now moving over to fans. So fans represent 51% of key appliance sales. And as you can see, the figures show that there's relative stability. So there has been quite a small decrease, which is the good news. So that's around 1% decrease since the second half of last year. And typically what we normally see in the first half of every year, we see increased sales in fans, and that is due to the increased temperature, and then there's more increased demand, and then there's greater impact in market. And that is also good news, picking up on the consumer side, so people become more resilient as they're purchasing more fans and they're able to adapt to the heat factor. So that 1% decrease is what we, so that's the good news. And then also, if we take into account the seasonality sales in the first half of 2021, unfortunately, there is still a 13% lower sales percentage than the first half in 2020, which we can see in the darker orange pillar. And then moving over to the third appliance, which is the refrigeration unit. So sales have remained relatively stable. Looking at the chart, if you can see that stability line across the chart, but there has been a 2% fall in sales, so not as bad. We can see the market stabilizing since the second half of 2020. And now I'm going to hand over to you, Elisa, for the solar water pumps.
Thanks, Sherry. Hi, everyone. Sherry has already covered TV, fans, refrigerator. And so I'll share some of the highlights that we see from the solar water pump sales. And maybe before we dive in, I'll just make a very quick caveat here. For large appliances, especially for solar water pump, we're capturing a relatively small portion of the sale in the solar water pump market. And I think that's particular because we have limited visibility on sales happening in the South Asian market. And so when you look at these trends, please take a little grain of salt there. But on the highest level, in the first half of 2021, more than 6,000 units of solar water pump were sold globally. And this is a slight decrease of 20% compared to the previous period. And we think this might be related to the ecosystem challenge that industry is experiencing, such as logistical challenge due to COVID and also the global supply chain issues. But on a positive note, if we're looking at the longer term trends, the solar water pump sales in this period is more than doubled compared to the first half of 2019, and which is the before the impact of COVID. The graph here really shows the sales volume across a time period between like 2018 to 2021. And you will see there's up and down here, but overall solar water pump sales grow pretty steadily. There's a huge spike in the second half of 2019, and that's due to programmatic intervention in South Asia. The government supported procurement program in India was driving most of the sales then. But then now zooming into the sales data in this period, we're seeing the PAYGO is driving 85% of solar water pump sales. And this shows that the high upfront cost is a key barrier for mass adoption of consumers. And also that providing consumer financing can really go a long way to improve product affordability, especially for bigger and more expensive productive use equipment like solar water pumps. We've seen strong solar water pump sales in East Africa, which represents 70% of the global sales. Kenya alone represents 50% of the global sales. And these sales are driven by a company that have very strong Kenya presence. There's also a number of financing programs currently focused on solar water pump in East Africa. And as a result, we're just seeing increasing focus and engagement with this product category. And in contrast, India has traditionally been a very strong solar water pump market because the large government support there. But we're also seeing the effect might be tapering off slightly. In the first half of 2021, around 900 units of solar water pump sales were reported in India, and that represents about 14% of global sales. And again, I want to caveat that the low sales volume in India could be because we just don't have great visibility on the sales volume in the South Asian market. And now I'll hand this over back to Oliver to discuss other insights.
Thanks, Elisa. Yeah, so thanks a lot. I'll be kind of doubling down on my first comment that the global headlines don't give you the full picture by sharing kind of the situation in the three key regional markets for off-grid lighting products. And as you can see here, West Africa, East Africa, South Asia have been following very different trends, especially if you look at the last 4 rounds, so pre-COVID and the 3 rounds during the COVID pandemic. I'll start with West Africa, but won't go into too much detail as it will be covered by Joe in the next insights. But from a regional perspective, we see sales volumes grow 10% compared to the second half of 2020, and we're now 34% higher than the second half of 2019. So continued strong growth despite the pandemic, and the 0.5 million figure that you can see in the chart is actually something like 478,000 units. But more on that later. On the East African side, as you can see, this resembles a bit the trends that we can see in the global figures, as it's the largest market. We see this a small dip in sales compared to the second half of 2020. Once again, here seasonality is a factor, so it's potentially hiding, and seasonality is not a real decrease. But we're not back on the growth trajectory, and we're not back to the units sold that we were in the second half of 2019. However, we are, second half of 2020 and first half of 21 are the second and third best half years, looking back at the sales volumes. And underneath this these sales volumes, there's discrepancies within the region. Kenya, which is the regional powerhouse and the most mature off-grid solar lighting product market, has proved very stable throughout the crisis. Whilst countries like Tanzania, Rwanda, and Zambia have actually seen significant growth over the last 6 to 12 months. On other countries, they've been affected by other trends. For example, I mean, COVID restrictions have been quite severe in Uganda. Obviously, the conflict in Tigray and economic issues in Ethiopia have meant that these markets have seen sales further decrease this round. Finally, for South Asia, South Asia has been on a declining trend since before COVID, since 2018. We're seeing the product mix kind of move away from the products that we traditionally capture, typically solar lanterns, and a move towards more weak grid or grid connected options in this market. Obviously, COVID-19 has accelerated this trend. We can see it in the evolution of sales from 2019 to 2020. And India, which is the largest market in the region, has been quite severely hit by the COVID pandemic, including during this data collection round. The COVID wave that hit India in spring 2021 was particularly devastating, and obviously had a strong impact on companies' ability to operate within the country. So once again, yeah, doubling down on this idea that the global headline figures do not give you the full story, and yeah, we're encouraging people to dig in. And I'll then hand over to Joe for West Africa.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, and in West Africa is actually, we do see the modest growth over the last years, and we also saw that the region as a whole fared relatively well throughout the pandemic. In the last reporting period, we saw particularly strong growth in the entry-level categories, but also in the multi-light and small solar home system categories for both pay-go and cash sales. The driver for West Africa growth is Nigeria. It is the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse in the region. And interestingly, in Nigeria, we do see that pay-as-you-go sales have now outpaced cash sales. So for the first time, we see more products being sold in Nigeria on pay-as-you-go than on cash. One of the main drivers for growth that has been quoted by companies is the results-based financing that is implemented by the government's National Electrification Project, funded by the World Bank. We also see that other markets in West Africa have fared quite well, and much of that can, like in Nigeria, be attributed to government support. So on the very right-hand side, we see Togo that has seen quite stable sales throughout the pandemic, but also modest growth in the last 2 reporting periods. And the government there is implementing the CESAR program, which has provided continued support to the off-grid solar players active in the market, and that has demonstrated to be quite beneficial for the sustained growth even throughout the crisis. In Senegal, we see a massive spike in the last half. Some of that we do think is attributable to the VAT exemption that has been introduced towards the end of last year. Of course, maybe not all of it, but certainly some of the increase has to do with VAT exemptions. The companies all over the world continue to report that VAT exemptions have a great impact on market development, and we're sure that some of that has also translated in the Senegal market. In Sierra Leone, we also see good growth again. What is interesting in Sierra Leone is that actually a quite stable enabling environment has attracted many different players, including also more and more local players, leading to a quite vibrant market development there with many active companies and many products available to customers. As with other regions and as with those sales data overall, it is still a mixed picture also in West Africa. I would really invite you to have a look at different country performances. Not all of them did fare as well as the countries we are displaying here. Some countries did see stagnating growth or even a decline, and that includes, for instance, Benin, Ghana, but also the Ivory Coast, where political instability has certainly also led to less growth in many segments, also the off-grid solar segment. Handing over to Cherie.
Thank you, Joe. So my second insight that I've chose to present today is to look at the different sales of TVs across different sizes of the TV appliances. So as you can see, we're looking at the small, medium, large and extra large TVs. So TV sales have significantly decreased in comparison with the second half in 2020, and large TVs boost the lion's share of sales. The majority, which is approximately 52% of TVs that have sold, are in the large category, as you can see. And these large TVs have been a main, there's been main demand for them for several factors. So particularly associated with efficiency gains on large TV electricity consumption. So which means that now it's similar to smaller TVs. And then also due to off-grid benefits from economies of scale, production of components shared with off-grid connected TV manufacturing, which favors, again, large TVs. So these factors, and combined with customers' appreciations for large TVs rather than smaller TVs, they have been the main factors that have driven the market. So if we look at the TV sales across all of these different categories, we can also see that there is the large TVs have the last two pillars in the chart that represents the large TVs. We can see that there's a 17,000 unit reduction. So that's minus 17 in comparison with the second half, which was 2020. But actually, it was also the extra large TVs, which is the last chart. You can see where there is the 27% decrease. So in 2021 in comparison to the second half of 2020. So that's minus 21. And then looking at COVID, as it's impacted the market as a whole, it has also impacted the sales of TV appliances. So that, along with stock out, not enough TVs available in the market, and then that's leading also to a price increase. So these components, along with that major impact, have affected the sales of TVs, and not forgetting also the solar home systems. So typically TVs are sold in bundles, and as we said, that has been impacted. So there's an 11% decrease in the sale volumes since pre-COVID times and in the first half of 2019. But if we also look at the extra large TVs, we can also see, and this is probably the upside, if we look at the results that we have in 2021, and then we look back at December 2019, and then at January to June 2020 was in. So hopefully it could continue in that direction. So industry reports have indicated that we will continue to see in the next half the same situation, typically on TVs. And the last point for me is that 81% of TVs that have been sold in bundles, and 99% of them have been reported to be pay-go sales. In the larger the system, the more likely TVs will be sold in bundles. The off-the-grid TV markets are dominated by sales in sub-Saharan Africa. And now over to you, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Cherie. And similar to what Joe has already mentioned about West Africa market, key appliance sales in West Africa are also showing signs of return to growth after a sharp decrease in sale in the first half of 2020. And in this period, The sales of key appliances in West Africa reached 93,000 units. Appliance sales volume of around 10% compared to the previous period, and almost on par with the second half of 2019, and so pre-COVID period. And this is really a positive sign that we're seeing there, early but positive. And particularly, we're seeing significant growth for refrigerators and fans in the region. Both products record their highest sales volume since the beginning of data collection process for appliances starting in 2018. And in this period, over 1,500 units were sold for each product type. And for fans, we think the increase in sales is likely associated with a strong solar energy system sales there, especially for solar energy kits that's like smaller than 20 watt peak. Because fans are quite low in energy consumption, they can easily be powered and bundled in a smaller solar energy kits. For refrigerators, we think the strong sales of refrigerator might be linked to the cooling demand from the fishery industry and activity in the region. And within the West Africa region, Nigeria is really driving the growth of appliance sales, with 38% of sales volume increase compared to the second half of 2020. While sales kind of grew across all different appliance type, the increase in sales primarily driven by fans, with a 50% increase compared to the previous period. We're also seeing moderate growth for appliance sales in Sierra Leone, Senegal, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And while it's really great to see growth in some of these West African countries, we also want to note that the recovery path for some of these countries in the region remain quite uncertain, right? For example, we also see some small decrease of sales in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and Guinea. And with that, I believe that's all the insight that all the panelists want to highlight in this segment. And I'll hand this back to Chef for the Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. I think it's really powerful to see the data translated through your descriptions of the numbers, and also the background narrative and the dynamics that we are seeing. But now we're going to hand over to you, the audience. So please continue to write your question in the chat box, in the Q&A box. One question that we have in already, and if I can direct that one to you, Joe, is on the growth rate that we saw before the pandemic. It's actually two questions. One question is, when is the growth expected to come back to the historical annual growth rate that we saw before the pandemic? And the second question is, do you expect this growth then to be higher or lower?
I guess that's the multi-million-dollar question we are all asking ourselves. When will we be back on that growth trajectory? So maybe will the growth be higher or lower than pre-pandemic? It's difficult to predict, but what we have seen in the last market trend report that was put out, that we actually need a minimum of a 13% year-on-year growth rate to make sure OffGrid Solar is making its contribution to SDG 7. Even pre-pandemic, we have not been on that growth level. We have been around, I think, 10%. So hopefully, after the pandemic, the sector will start to grow at a faster pace again to really meet the SDG 7 goal, and of course to electrify millions of households. Whether and how this will happen and when the growth will come back is, there's so many variables to it, right? That it's really difficult to make a prediction and to say with any certainty when that will be. Certainly, we are hopeful that to see that the markets have stabilized in this period. We see some seasonality, which are some hints that the market has partially maybe recovered, but we also see in some markets that it's still quite a tough situation. So it's very varied. And that also has to do with the many different factors that Oliver already pointed towards when he introduced his first slide. We have many factors beyond the pandemic that influence the numbers that we're seeing, that will continue to influence the numbers that we're seeing. So, for instance, the global supply challenges that we're seeing, not only on the OffGrid Solar sector, but around the globe on many products, is of course a factor. And we don't know by when this will be over, but we don't expect it to be over in the next half year. At least companies don't expect it to be over in the next half year. Then there's also the question around the political stability or instability. We see that major markets in East Africa are undergoing political instability. If and when this will be back to normal, it's really difficult to say. And of course, the trend that we're seeing in South Asia that has been a declining trend already pre-pandemic, it's a big question mark whether that can be turned around into a growth trajectory again, or whether it's a question of stabilizing that market, but focusing more on growth in East Africa, West Africa, and maybe also Southern Africa again. Certainly what will be needed to really unlock more growth and ensuring that we reach SDG 7 is to activate more markets, activate many more markets. The last SDG 7 report has actually shown that most of the unconnected people are now living in fragile and conflict-prone states. So we need to also, as a sector, find a way to activate those markets where it's even more difficult to do business than it is in the markets that are vibrant today. I'm sure colleagues might have other views to this as well. These are just, my 2 cents on the predictions for the future, which are very difficult at any time, but even more difficult in a moment like this, where it's really anybody's guess what's going to happen in the next few months, unfortunately.
Great, thank you, Jo. I think we also have a few clarifying questions around refrigerators. And Elisa, if I can go to you for those. One question is if you could expand a little bit more on the refrigerator adoption we see in East Africa. And the other question is how refrigerators are sold mostly. Is that bundled or cash?
Great, thanks for these questions. And I think just like maybe going back to some of these data that we're seeing in refrigerator, I think we're seeing that the refrigerator sales are pretty stable, right? Like even with the impact of COVID, really this period we see about like 2% decrease. And so really it's not that much of decrease even with the COVID going on. But that's also to say that the refrigerator market hasn't been growing as much as we hope we will see, right? I think like if you look at the charts, it's pretty much stable, like 5,000 units of sales for each period. And I think like there may be a couple of reasons and dynamics kind of driving the different like sales and adoptions in the East Africa region. I think like, first of all, I think there's like a couple RBF programs that's kind of like trying to drive and facilitate some of the refrigerator sales. And we see some of those like programs come into play and really have a positive impact on the sales of the refrigerator. And the reason why the sales is still taking a while to kind of take up, I think like cost is one of the really major barrier for consumers over there. Just like, a typical refrigerator unit can really go up to, like sometimes in the south ends of the US dollars range. And so really like it's quite hard, especially like during this like economic downturn to have consumers to be able to afford this product category. But I think parts of that, it's also related to the consumer awareness in the region, right? Because like we, based on some of our interaction and interview with the consumers, sometimes they don't always see the values of having a refrigerator only for household use. But if we're talking about like the income generation activity, like selling beverage, using a fishery, that's obviously another story, making it much stronger case for end user to be taking up the refrigerator, even given with a high cost. And one other thing I'll also caveat here is that maybe larger refrigerator sales are not well captured in this report, right? Because like we're seeing in the report that like most of the refrigerator are currently like bundled with solar energy system, especially in the East Africa region. And I think that's like largely true, but that we're also kind of like overlooking this like other market, right? Because a lot of like a refrigerator is like sold as an independent unit without the solar energy kits in the cash market, especially like for those like the retail market. And so like I would want to say like we see a big portion of like, you know, bundle and pay-go sales of refrigerator in East Africa, but like there's also a larger market, and maybe we you know, haven't like dived too much into the insight of that other market segment there. And the other thing that I would also mention is that even though the refrigerator adoption hasn't been increased significantly in the past couple of years, we're seeing a huge increase of like medical use of type of refrigerator. But like, you know, that's a completely different type of refrigerator with very different use case. So we're not going to like really discuss it too much during this call, but just to note that, you know, there's this like really increased use of like medical use refrigerator with many programs supporting it.
Great, thank you, Eliza. Maybe if I can stick with you for a moment for one more question. Mm-hmm. So we had a question if we know what's the main usage of the fridges that are being sold. You just mentioned vaccines a little bit, but maybe you could expand a bit on that a little bit more.
Yeah, and really I could only say from our experience and for our field testing work, we're seeing that quite a lot of consumers in the East Africa region are using it for like commercial purpose, right? And so like that could mean like selling like juice, beverage, you know, soda to consumer. And so they're primarily using this as an income generating opportunity. And like a lot of them already kind of run a small shop, right? And it's like for them to kind of expand that business operation to be able to like sell like additional stuff. We're also seeing some of the companies, I say in South Asia, right? They're also like doing this for like commercial use, but like, you know, selling different type of stuff. And so sometimes it's ice cream. And so really, I think like a stronger case for refrigerator, it's all about like the commercial activity, whether it's driving the sales for you know, a beverage or like, you know, using it for fishery. It's the main cases that we're seeing.
Great, thank you very much for that. Oliver, we have a question that I think I want to ask to you. It's on the split between freezers and fridge sales. Can you perhaps expand a bit on that?
Yeah, of course. What we see at the global level is that the vast majority of the refrigeration unit sales that we capture are refrigeration. We do see, though, even if it's still very small elements of the market, we do see a slight growth in multi-temperature fridges and fridges with at least some element of freezing capacity, where the freezers are multi-temperature. This kind of also links to what Elisa was saying around potential commercial use. Typically, she mentioned fisheries. This is also an area where we're seeing it drive the kind of freezer capacity in the market. But as you saw in the data, fridges are the major part of a fairly small market. So we're talking about limited number of units, but we still see that trend.
Great, thank you very much, Oliver. One more question we have is around the addressable market. Someone who says, okay, we see the total sales in 2021 around 3.4 million. We also see that in the previous years, some companies are reporting higher sales than normal sales in H2 2020 and H1 2021. Question is really, okay, what is the addressable market that we're seeing, and has that changed at all due to the pandemic? Joe, if I can direct that question to you.
Sure. So maybe I'm not sure I would label this just that Oliver said it's higher than usual sales. It's good. It's good to see. We want to see this sector growing, right? And that means that we want to see most of the companies reporting higher sales each round. So what we do see though, and is that some companies have recovered much better from the crisis than other companies have. And I think that's the main message really here. On the addressable market, we will be doing much more analysis on that in the market trends report, which we're working together with GOGLA on, and also CLASP, slated to come out somewhere next year, where we will do much more analysis on it. I think one thing that will impact the addressable market quite significantly is the fact that about 100 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty due to the COVID-19 crisis. And that just means affordability levels have gone down quite significantly. And that will have a major impact on the addressable market for solar home systems and off-grid appliances more generally speaking.
Great, thank you very much for that. We have one more question, and that is on the supply chain disruptions. It was mentioned that the overall solar home system sales are on a downward trend, also because we see supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. The question is if someone could share a bit more detail on that and what's actually happening. Leo, I think you're on the line. Could you perhaps share some insights on that?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, I think many of us may be aware of the supply chain disruptions over the previous year, months, and if not, we're all starting to see the impact of this. So supply chain disruptions are of course across the board. We're starting to now see issues in many industrialized countries, even getting regular supplies. Yeah. So what we're just pointing at is looking at the impact of this on our sector. There are general disruptions. We're hearing they can fall into a couple of main categories. One is the increasing cost of shipping, which is radically affecting bottom lines, and that can of course affect profitability and influence whether or not it's even viable, particularly for small orders, to actually make those small orders. And back to Joe's point, not all these factors affect everyone equally. So we can imagine smaller orders, less viable businesses finding it harder to take these hits on their bottom line of overall profitability. But what we're also noticing, again, you see global trends such as the lack of the increasing shortage of chips for high-tech equipment. Anecdotal reports is what we're receiving there, where supply chain disruptions are such that the cost again is increasing for these components, but also the opportunity cost for the suppliers of components is changing. So it makes it less attractive again to produce these components for smaller orders, less profitable, etc. And so we've heard examples of companies who are actually having to drop appliances out of their range because of the cost of those individual components is increasing so much that they would have to increase the sale price of that appliance beyond what customers seem willing to pay. And therefore, the only choice may be to actually stop producing some of those small appliances in the short term. So those are a couple of small trends. I think the other noticeable one is how this does affect different appliances in different ways, as we just noted there. Not all appliances have those chips in them. Not all of these solar power systems have a lot of these in. But one of the key notable trends again is on TVs. We're receiving a lot of reports about the cost for screens and components of televisions is one of those areas that's being negatively affected. So really, this is one of the overarching points that I think has been made by several of the other panelists. That's the main area. Could I just quickly add on the refrigeration? I'd just like to compliment what Elisa was saying. One key point just to highlight, as was said in the methodology, is what is the focus of this report? So we do not include the walk-in cold rooms, which is really a new segment that we're seeing. It's not a new segment. It is, to the point, it's one of the many segments in the refrigeration space. We're tracking what are generally called chest freezers or the upright fridge freezers in this report. And everything Eliza said applies there. What we are seeing a growth of the use of these for productive use in agriculture, livestock, and dairy, as Eliza said. So that really can be influencing sales quite significantly. Several of your companies are really entrepreneurially developing these services, particularly in West Africa. We're seeing the growth, and I just wanted to note that again, we do not track the growth, the walk-in cold rooms, because they're so large with several kilowatt systems, they're out of our immediate scope. Watch this space. One of the reasons we're not tracking it also is because that space has been very small. But again, to the points of what growth is happening, we are definitely seeing a surge in growth in walk-in cold room innovation, business model development across Africa, which is, but the overall market is being led in India, in the world, very much so for walk-in cold room innovation. So that's a separate topic, but important to note. That is a positive trend, which we don't include here. Thank you, over.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leo, and also for adding a bit more context on that, on the story around refrigerator use. We have another question. I think I'm gonna ask that to you, Oliver. You mentioned how the companies are faring differently in this pandemic. Some see quite stable sales, or actually are increasing sales again. For others, sales are still lacking. Do we have any insights into why some companies are doing better than others, being confronted with the pandemic?
Sure. I mean, there's obviously, I mean, as I think Jo highlighted in her answers to the predictability of the future. I mean, and as I've highlighted in the as I presented that in the first slide, I mean, there's a multiplicity of factors affecting different markets. Typically, government's choice to declare or not that off-grid lighting was an essential service would have had a severe effect on companies' ability to operate within different countries. There has been differences in ability for companies to raise funds and access finance to weather the crisis. There has been significant differences as well in policy adaptation to the COVID situation. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint a single determining factor that would kind of be your go-to solution to why a company might have done better during the crisis. It's a multiplicity of factors. Uncertainty has certainly been very present in the market for the past 12 months. So I know it's not a very clear and concise response, but yeah, the devil is in the detail, and everybody is confronted to a multiplicity of different factors that are affecting them in a myriad of different ways. So yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. Leo, over to you for another question. We have a follow-up question on the supply chain issue. Do you have any insights into how different companies tackle that issue of supply chain disruptions in the market?
Thank you. That's a very quick response. No, we don't. We have not dived into this as a organization or group. I would consider it's worth following up with that participant and GOGLA for ourselves to look at offline. Maybe you can address that on your side, Chef. I know there are several key topical issues. You have your criteria, you know, as there are so many of them, which you then dive into and do look into some of these topics. So this could well be one of those subjects which really is worth getting clarity on. But at the moment, we have heard anecdotal reports from individual companies, which at this stage, you know, we keep confidential. And so we only share these generic insights as we have. But yeah, so I think you just have to infer from what I was saying and from what you can find on the web for the kind of impacts and which kind of companies, which kind of products those will apply. Well, let's take that as a topic area for potential follow-up. Could be, thank you, could be a great topic for a blog to look into that. Thanks for that point.
Great, Leo, thanks. Yeah, and I fully agree with that. I think I'm afraid we're on top of time. Thank you very much to the panelists. And I also want to ask the audience if I can keep you for a few minutes longer, because I want to share one last poll that will help us understand how insightful this presentation was for you. So let me do that now. It helps us again to figure out if there are other things we need to be doing in regard to the presentation moving forward. Also If you have more elaborate feedback on the webinar structure or on the report, please send a message to Oliver. His email is shown on the slide here at the bottom. And also please feel free to reach out to us if your question has not been answered. We will still try to answer it. So yeah, please do that. I will leave the poll open for 1 or 2 seconds more. Great, let me share the results now. I'm happy that the majority of the people thought the webinar was helpful. I also think that some people think it could have contained more information. Yeah, again, thank you for your feedback, and indeed do send an email to Oliver in case you're looking for more information. Let me stop that sharing that. Yeah, and with that, we're at the end of this webinar. Before we close, here are a couple of different links we have in terms of the report page and our Impact Hub. These slides will be made available afterwards, so you can check these in your own time. And with that, thanks again to our panelists, and also thank you for being an attentive audience. That's very much appreciated. So bye-bye and take care for now.